When I stood in the audience pretending to be the proud and supportive wife, I never imagined my perfectly crafted plan would explode in my face. What happens when a web of lies turns into a live broadcast of humiliation? Stay with me, because you won't believe what happened next. The awards ceremony was the pinnacle of Daniel's career, a moment where he would stand in front of a live audience of industry leaders, accept a prestigious honor, and bask in the limelight. To the outside world, we were the perfect couple. Daniel was the charming and accomplished businessman, and I, Rebecca, was his supportive, elegant wife. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the scenes, our marriage had been unraveling for months. Late nights at the office, mysterious phone calls, and his growing distance left me stewing in suspicion. I had always prided myself on being in control, but lately I felt as if Daniel was slipping away. He was becoming a stranger, detached, preoccupied, and worst of all, seemingly uninterested in me. Every unanswered question fueled my paranoia. Was he seeing someone else? Was I no longer enough? I knew I wasn't perfect, though I'd never admit it to him. For months, I had been indulging in a secret of my own. Matt, a younger colleague, was the kind of man who made me feel alive again. Desired, adored, and thrillingly reckless. He was everything Daniel had stopped being. Matt and I shared stolen moments during lunch breaks, flirtatious texts in the dead of night, and an affair that made me feel as if I had regained control. But the truth was, I didn't love Matt. He was a pawn in a larger game, a means to reclaim the upper hand in my marriage. If Daniel was going to cheat on me, why shouldn't I beat him to it? Still, it wasn't enough. The bitterness gnawed at me. I couldn't simply wait for Daniel to slip up. I needed to expose him, to make him face the same humiliation I was feeling. And what better stage than the award ceremony? All eyes would be on him, and I would make sure that the image of his betrayal was burned into everyone's mind. The plan was simple, or so I thought. I spent weeks gathering evidence. I scoured his emails, pieced together out-of-contact messages, and even staged fake receipts for hotel stays. Matt, bless his gullible heart, agreed to help. He had no idea that this wasn't just about exposing Daniel, it was about ensuring my own vindication. He deserves it, I told Matt one evening, brushing my hand across his cheek to quiet his hesitations. He's been lying to me for months. The day of the ceremony arrived, and I played my part flawlessly. I wore a sleek black dress that hugged my figure, a reminder to Daniel and everyone else of what he stood to lose. My hair was swept up in a polished bun, my makeup perfected to exude effortless sophistication. As we stepped out of the car onto the red carpet, he glanced at me briefly, offering a small, polite smile, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Was he thinking about her, whoever she was? The thought sent a fresh wave of resentment coursing through me. Inside, the venue buzzed with energy. Tables were set with pristine white linens, the room illuminated by a soft golden glow. Daniel mingled effortlessly with the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, while I lingered at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of champagne. From across the hall, I caught sight of Matt, blending into the crowd as we'd planned. His presence was meant to calm my nerves, but instead, it only reminded me of the precariousness of my scheme. If anything went wrong, everything I'd built, my image, my reputation, could crumble in an instant. Finally, the ceremony began. The MC took the stage, a charismatic figure who effortlessly commanded the room. Speeches were made, awards were handed out, and the anticipation grew as the moment we'd all been waiting for approached. And now, the MC announced, his voice echoing through the hall, the Entrepreneur of the Year award goes to Daniel Harper. The room erupted into applause as Daniel stood, adjusting his suit jacket before making his way to the stage. I clapped too, my smile fixed in place, though my heart was racing. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. As Daniel reached the podium, his face lit up with a genuine smile, the kind that used to make me fall in love with him. For a brief second, doubt flickered in my mind. Was I really doing the right thing? But it was too late now. The wheels were already in motion. Daniel began his speech, thanking the organization, his colleagues, and of course his wonderful wife. My stomach twisted at the words, the irony too much to bear. The producers, who were in on my plan, were waiting for my signal. I gave a slight nod, and the screen behind Daniel flickered to life. The audience murmured in confusion as an image appeared, a damning screenshot of an email thread, followed by a blurry photo of Daniel entering what appeared to be a hotel room. The murmurs turned to gasps as the slideshow continued, each image more incriminating than the last. I kept my face carefully composed, feigning shock and disbelief. "What's going on?" someone whispered nearby. Daniel turned to glance at the screen, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. And then Daniel did something I didn't expect. He laughed. The sound of Daniel's laughter reverberated through the room, cutting through the tension like a blade. The crowd sat stunned, unsure whether they were witnessing a cruel prank or the unraveling of a very public scandal. I could feel my own smile faltering as Daniel turned back to the audience, his expression calm, even amused. Well, he began, gripping the edges of the podium with steady hands. "This is, unexpected, but not entirely surprising." His voice was smooth, confident, with none of the panic or defensiveness I had anticipated. My stomach dropped. This wasn't how he was supposed to react. He gestured toward the screen, where the incriminating photos were still cycling through. "I assume whoever arranged this wanted to make a statement, and they've certainly succeeded. But since we're airing secrets tonight, perhaps I should add some context." The room was silent, every eye trained on Daniel. My heart pounded as I watched him reach into his suit jacket and pull out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before glancing back at the crowd, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Let's start with the first image, shall we?" The producers, clearly caught off guard by Daniel's composure, hesitated before pausing the slideshow on the initial screenshot. It was an email, one I had carefully crafted to look like correspondence between Daniel and an unnamed woman. Daniel held up his phone. "Now, I can see how this might look damning at first glance, but let me direct your attention to this email's timestamp." He swiped to another screen and held it up for all to see, zooming in on a calendar entry. This supposed romantic rendezvous happened to coincide with a business trip to Chicago, one that I attended with my entire executive team. A murmur rippled through the audience as he looked pointedly at a table near the front, where several of his colleagues nodded in confirmation. I felt the blood drain from my face. How had he known to prepare for this? Daniel's voice softened, but there was an edge to it like a razor hidden beneath silk. "And now, the next image, please." The producers hesitated again, but complied, advancing to the blurry photo of him entering what appeared to be a hotel room. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I have to hand it to whoever planned this. They certainly have a flair for drama. But let me make one thing clear. I've never stayed in that hotel in my life. In fact," he tapped his phone again, this time displaying a geotagged photo of himself with a group of colleagues at a completely different location on the same date. "I was here that night, attending a charity gala." The murmurs grew louder. I could feel eyes darting toward me, curiosity and suspicion beginning to brew. My hands clenched the edges of my chair as I struggled to maintain my composure. "And now," Daniel said, his tone shifting, "let me share a little secret of my own." A cold chill swept through me. This wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't supposed to have the upper hand. Daniel's smile faded as he locked eyes with me, his gaze piercing and unrelenting. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "You've been busy, haven't you?" A gasp rippled through the audience. My breath hitched as Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it and extracted a stack of papers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice laced with grim amusement, "allow me to present Exhibit A." He held up a series of printed text messages. Messages between me and Matt. My heart stopped as I recognized the damning words, the flirtatious exchanges, the explicit promises. These, Daniel continued, are conversations between my wife and her co-worker, Matt. He practically spat the name, his disgust evident. The room erupted into shocked whispers. I felt my cheeks burn as I shrank lower in my chair, my carefully constructed facade crumbling around me. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But wait, Daniel said, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. There's more. He motioned to the producers, who hesitated but eventually complied, displaying new images on the screen. This time, the photos were of me, laughing with Matt at a cafe, entering his apartment, and even sharing an intimate moment on a park bench. The timestamps on each photo told a clear story, one that no amount of denial could refute. My vision blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I wanted to scream, to deny everything, but the evidence was undeniable. Daniel had outplayed me in every possible way. And finally, Daniel said, his voice hardening, "Let's hear from the man himself." He nodded toward the back of the room, where a figure began to move through the crowd. My stomach churned as Matt stepped forward, his face pale and stricken. "Matt," Daniel said, his tone almost mockingly cordial. "Care to explain your relationship with my wife?" Matt stammered, his gaze darting between me and Daniel. I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel smirked. "Really? Because I have a signed affidavit from a private investigator who witnessed the two of you together on multiple occasions." He held up the document for all to see. "Would you like me to read it out loud?" Matt's shoulders slumped, and he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and betrayal. "Rebecca," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You said he'd never find out?" The audience gasped. The weight of the moment crushed me, leaving me speechless. Daniel turned back to the crowd, his expression calm but resolute. "This wasn't how I wanted tonight to go," he admitted. "But sometimes the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard someone tries to hide it." He stepped away from the podium, his gaze sweeping over the audience before settling on me. "Rebecca," he said, his voice soft but cutting, "I trusted you. I built a life with you, and this is how you repay me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of my actions, the humiliation of being exposed so publicly, was too much to bear. Daniel turned and walked off the stage, leaving me alone in the spotlight. The room erupted into chaos. Whispers, stares, and even a few scattered cheers for Daniel's dramatic takedown. I felt the walls closing in around me, the air thick with judgment and condemnation. As I sat there, frozen in my seat, one thought consumed me. I had set out to destroy Daniel, but in the end, I had only destroyed myself. The room buzzed with electricity, a mix of murmured shock, awkward glances, and the distant click of cameras capturing the fallout. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on me, dissecting my every twitch, my every breath. My legs felt like lead as I tried to stand, but my knees buckled, forcing me back into the chair. The spotlight from the stage cast an unforgiving glow over my face, highlighting the sheer humiliation coursing through my body. Daniel stood at the edge of the stage, his back to me now as he exchanged quiet words with one of the event organizers. He exuded calm control, a stark contrast to the storm swirling inside me. My mind raced, trying to piece together how he'd managed to pull this off. How long had he known? How much of this had he planned in advance? And most hauntingly, had he ever truly loved me, or had our marriage been a facade, just like tonight's ceremony had turned into? Matt, now a figure of equal shame, stood frozen a few feet from the stage, his face pale and slick with sweat. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his eyes darting nervously between me and Daniel. It was as if he was waiting for a signal, some way out of this mess, but none would come. When Daniel turned back to the podium, the entire room hushed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice a steady hum of authority, "I think it's clear that tonight's events have veered off course." He paused, letting the tension stretch to a breaking point. "But I believe moments like these, moments of uncomfortable truth, can teach us something valuable about trust, about honesty, and about the consequences of deceit." My breath hitched. He was using this, all of it, as a moral lesson. And he was doing it with the same charm and eloquence that had made him the darling of the business world. People weren't just sympathizing with him. They were rallying behind him. Daniel's gaze locked onto mine, piercing and unrelenting. "Rebecca," he said, addressing me directly for the first time since this nightmare began. His voice softened, but it carried an undeniable edge. "I stood by you through everything. Through challenges in my career, through moments when I doubted myself. And I believed you stood by me too." The room was silent, save for the faint clicking of silverware and glasses being discreetly removed by waitstaff, desperate to avoid the brewing confrontation. My throat felt dry, as though I were choking on the weight of my own shame. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. And what could I say that wouldn't sound hollow in the face of his calm, calculated revelation? "I know what you're thinking," Daniel continued, addressing the crowd now. "You're wondering how someone so accomplished, so seemingly put together, could miss the signs, could allow something like this to happen." He chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "And the truth is, I didn't miss the signs. I chose to ignore them. I told myself that the distance between us was temporary, that the late nights and cold shoulders would pass. I convinced myself that love, true love, meant looking past imperfection." Daniel's voice cracked slightly on the last word, a fleeting glimpse of the vulnerability he was otherwise concealing so well. For a brief moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who had swept me off my feet with his unwavering confidence and quiet kindness. But now he was someone else entirely, someone I had pushed to his breaking point. "Rebecca," Daniel said again, returning his gaze to me, "I'm going to ask you one question, and I'd like an honest answer. For once." My stomach twisted into a knot. I braced myself, clutching the edge of the table to steady my trembling hands. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a knife. The question landed with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't what I had expected, and yet it was the only thing that truly mattered. My lips parted, but no sound came out. How could I answer that, standing in the wreckage of everything I had destroyed? I began, my voice shaky and weak. "I did love you. I do love you." The words sounded desperate, pleading, even to my own ears. I didn't know how to reach you anymore. You were so distant, so focused on work. I felt invisible." Daniel's expression didn't waver. "So instead of telling me how you felt, you sought validation elsewhere? You plotted to humiliate me, to make me out to be the villain?" His voice grew sharper, each word laced with bitterness. "You didn't just betray me, Rebecca. You betrayed us." Tears stung my eyes as I shook my head, trying to will myself out of this waking nightmare. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," I whispered. "I just wanted you to see me again." He stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching unbearably. Then he spoke, his voice steady but cold. "I saw you, Rebecca. I always saw you. But now, I see you for who you really are." The finality in his tone hit me like a physical blow. My body slumped forward, and I buried my face in my hands, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like a vice. Around me, the audience shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room palpable. But Daniel wasn't finished. He turned to the crowd one last time, his composure as unshakable as ever. To everyone here tonight, I apologize for the spectacle. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a scandal. But life is messy, and sometimes we're forced to face truths we'd rather ignore. He stepped away from the podium, pausing briefly to glance at me one final time. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Rebecca. But it won't be with me. With that, he walked off the stage, leaving me alone under the harsh lights, exposed and defeated. The room erupted into murmurs as the guests began to disperse, their curiosity tempered by their discomfort. I sat there, paralyzed by the enormity of what had just transpired. Somewhere in the crowd, I saw Matt making his escape, his head low as he slipped toward the exit. Even he wanted no part in the disaster I had created. I was utterly, completely alone. And as the weight of Daniel's final words settled over me, I realized that I wasn't just losing him. I was losing everything. The ride home was eerily silent. I sat in the back of a cab, staring blankly out the window as the city lights blurred past. The sounds of the world outside, the hum of traffic, the occasional honk, and the muffled voices of pedestrians felt distant, almost as if they were happening to someone else. Inside, my thoughts were a whirlwind of regret, humiliation, and desperation. Daniel's words echoed in my mind. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but it won't be with me. His calm delivery had been far more devastating than any outburst could have been. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't raged, he had simply walked away. And that, somehow, hurt more than anything else. When the cab pulled up to the house, I hesitated before getting out. The home we had built together loomed in the darkness, a place that had once felt warm and secure, but now seemed cold and unfamiliar. I stepped inside, the door creaking as I closed it behind me. The silence was deafening. Daniel's absence was everywhere, in the stillness of the air, in the empty space where his shoes would normally be by the door, and in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the hallway. I wandered aimlessly through the house, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The dining table, where we used to share meals and talk about our days, now felt like a monument to a life that no longer existed. My hands trembled as I ran them along the surface, memories flashing through my mind. Anniversary dinners, quiet Sunday breakfasts, the laughter we used to share. How had I let it come to this? My phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me back to reality. I hesitated before picking it up, already knowing who it was. Sure enough, Matt's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a moment before swiping to reject the call. Whatever we'd shared, it was over now. He'd been a temporary distraction, a misguided attempt to fill the void that had grown between Daniel and me. But now, even the thought of him made me feel hollow. I dropped the phone onto the counter and sank into a chair, my head in my hands. The enormity of what I had done weighed on me like a physical burden. I had betrayed my husband, the man who had stood by me through thick and thin. I had destroyed our marriage, our trust, and the foundation we had built over the years. And for what? A fleeting sense of validation? A misguided attempt to punish him for something he hadn't even done? As the hours dragged on, I found myself retracing the steps that had led me here. I thought about the moments when I could have chosen differently, the times when I could have spoken to Daniel, told him how I was feeling, and tried to bridge the gap between us. Instead, I had let my insecurities fester, allowing them to drive a wedge between us. And in the end, it was my own actions, not his, that had destroyed us. Morning came far too quickly, bringing with it the harsh light of reality. I knew I couldn't hide in the house forever. The fallout from last night was already spreading. Messages from friends and acquaintances had started pouring in, each one more curious or judgmental than the last. The scandal was the talk of the town, and there was no escaping it. By noon, I mustered the courage to check my email. Among the flood of messages was one from Daniel's lawyer. My heart sank as I opened it. The email was polite but firm, outlining the terms of the divorce Daniel was initiating. He wasn't asking for much, just a clean break, no drawn-out battles, no messy disputes. It was clear he wanted to move on as quickly and quietly as possible. Tears blurred my vision as I read the words. This was it, the end of our marriage, the end of us. Over the next few days, I tried to reach out to him, but every call went unanswered, every text unreplied. He had cut me off completely, and I couldn't blame him. Why would he want to hear from me after everything I had done? One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling at a beach during our honeymoon, posing in front of a Christmas tree, laughing at a friend's wedding. Each image was a painful reminder of the life we had once shared, a life I had taken for granted. My chest ached with the weight of it all, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry openly, the tears flowing freely down my cheeks. But regret wasn't enough, I knew that. If I wanted to make things right, not with Daniel, but with myself, I needed to confront the deeper issues that had led me to this point. I began to see a therapist, someone who could help me unravel the tangled mess of emotions and insecurities that had driven my actions. It wasn't an easy process. Each session felt like peeling back a layer of myself, exposing the raw, unfiltered truth beneath, but it was necessary. Weeks turned into months. The divorce was finalized quietly, without drama. Daniel moved on, throwing himself into his work and becoming a respected advocate for honesty and resilience in relationships. I saw him once on television, delivering a speech at a leadership conference. He looked strong, confident, happy. And though it hurt to see him thriving without me, I was proud of him. As for me, I took things one day at a time. I focused on rebuilding my life, not as the wife of a successful businessman, but as my own person. I found a new job, made amends with friends I had neglected, and began to rediscover the parts of myself I had lost along the way. But there was one final revelation that would haunt me forever. A month after the divorce, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a photo album, one Daniel had put together for our anniversary. Each page was filled with memories of us, accompanied by handwritten notes about what each moment had meant to him. At the very end, there was a Rebecca. It read, "I was planning to surprise you with this on our anniversary. I wanted us to start fresh, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. But I guess it's too late for that now. I hope you find happiness, even if it's not with me." I clutched the album to my chest, my tears soaking into the pages. He had been planning a new beginning for us, even as I was plotting his downfall. And now that chance was gone forever. In the quiet of my empty house, I realized the truth. I had lost the one person who had truly loved me. And it was a loss I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The days after receiving the photo album from Daniel were some of the most sobering of my life. The weight of my decisions had never felt heavier. Every page I turned in that album was a painful reminder of what I had lost. Not just a husband, but a partner, a confidant, someone who had, despite my flaws, truly loved me. And now, I was left with the consequences of my betrayal. I began spending a lot of time alone, not out of self-pity but necessity. The whirlwind of drama that had consumed my life had left me exhausted. The relentless whispers from acquaintances, the judgmental glances from people in town, even the silence from mutual friends who had chosen to distance themselves, it all made me realize how fragile my social circle had been. People loved a scandal, but they didn't stick around to clean up the mess afterward. What lingered most, though, was Daniel's voice in my head. "I trusted you. You betrayed us." I had played those words over and over, dissecting every syllable. What hurt the most wasn't just his pain. It was knowing that I had ruined something irreplaceable. I had thrown away a love that could have been salvaged if I had only chosen honesty over manipulation. If I had just communicated with Daniel instead of letting my insecurities spiral out of control, maybe we wouldn't have ended up like this. It was during one of my therapy sessions that my therapist, a patient but firm woman named Ellen, finally asked me the question I had been avoiding. Why did you do it? I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the floor, trying to articulate the answer that had eluded me. Why had I done it? At the time, it had seemed so justified. I had felt ignored, unseen, unloved. But now, stripped of all the justifications, I could see the truth for what it was. I had let fear dictate my actions. Fear of rejection, fear of losing Daniel, fear of not being enough. I wanted control, I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt powerless in my marriage, like I was disappearing, and instead of fixing it, I tried to hurt him before he could hurt me. Ellen nodded, her gaze kind but unyielding. That's a start, but control isn't love, Rebecca, and love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about facing it together even when it's uncomfortable. Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. She was right, of course. I had been so consumed by my fear of being vulnerable that I had built walls around myself, walls that had shut Daniel out and eventually destroyed us. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into the work of rebuilding my life. I enrolled in an art class, something I had always wanted to do but never made time for. Painting became a form of therapy, a way to process the emotions I had buried for so long. I found myself drawn to abstract pieces of swirls of color that mirrored the chaos and complexity of my feelings. With every brushstroke, I felt a little more like myself again. I also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, something Daniel and I had once done together. At first it was difficult. Being around other women who had experienced betrayal or heartbreak forced me to confront my own actions in a new way. But over time, I began to find solace in helping others. Their strength inspired me, and their stories reminded me that even in the aftermath of pain, there was hope. But despite my efforts to move forward, there were moments when the weight of my mistakes felt unbearable. One afternoon, I found myself at the park where Daniel and I had once spent countless Sundays. The bench we used to sit on, laughing and sharing stories, was still there. I sat down, running my fingers over the worn wood, and let the memories wash over me. It was here that I allowed myself to confront a truth I had been avoiding. I had loved Daniel, deeply in fact, but I hadn't loved him in the way he deserved. My love had been conditional, tied to my own insecurities and expectations. When things got hard, I hadn't fought for us. I had fought to protect myself, even at his expense. And Daniel had loved me unconditionally. He had been patient, supportive, and willing to work through our struggles. But I hadn't given him the chance. I had taken his love for granted, assuming it would always be there, no matter how much I tested its limits. Sitting on that bench, I made a promise to myself. I couldn't undo the past, but I could learn from it. I could be better. Not for Daniel, but for me. I could learn to love without conditions, to communicate without fear, and to face my insecurities head on instead of letting them fester. Months passed, and life continued to move forward. Daniel and I had no contact, though I kept up with his life through mutual acquaintances. He had thrown himself into his work, using his experience to advocate for honesty and transparency in relationships. He had become something of a local hero, admired not just for his professional accomplishments, but for the dignity with which he had handled our very public fallout. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to apologize again, to tell him how much I had grown. But I knew it wouldn't be fair to him. He deserved to move on without being dragged back into my mess. And besides, some wounds were too deep to heal completely. The day I saw him again was unexpected. I was at a cafe downtown, sketching in my notebook, when I looked up and saw him walking past the window. He was laughing, his arm around a woman who was clearly smitten with him. She was beautiful, with a kind smile and an easy grace that made her seem effortlessly perfect. For a moment, I felt a pang of jealousy, followed by a wave of sadness. But then, something surprising happened. I smiled. Seeing him happy, genuinely happy, felt right. He had moved on, and so had I, in my own way. As they disappeared from view, I turned back to my notebook, my smile lingering. The sketch I had been working on was of a sunrise, vibrant and hopeful. It felt symbolic, somehow, a reminder that even after the darkest nights, the sun would rise again. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago. I was stronger, wiser, and more willing to face the uncomfortable truths about myself. And while I couldn't undo the damage I had done, I could honor the lessons it had taught me. In the end, I realized life wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about learning from them, growing because of them, and finding a way to move forward, even if it meant doing so alone. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The cool air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I walked along the familiar park trail, the same one where Daniel and I used to spend our Sundays, but this time, I wasn't here to dwell on the past. I was here to let it go. In my hands, I held the photo album Daniel had sent me, the one filled with memories of our life together. It had sat on my shelf for months, a bittersweet reminder of what I had lost. But now, I felt ready to release it. Not out of regret or sorrow, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the love we had shared, however fleeting, and for the lessons it had taught me. As I reached the park's pond, I paused, the gentle ripples of the water reflecting the sky above. I opened the album one last time, flipping through the pages slowly, allowing myself to smile at the memories instead of cry. The photo of us on our honeymoon, laughing as the waves crashed behind us. The candid shot Daniel had taken of me baking cookies in the kitchen, my face dusted with flour. The Christmas mornings, the anniversaries, the quiet moments in between, all of it had shaped me, for better or worse. I closed the album and set it down on the bench beside me. It wasn't an act of abandonment, but of acceptance. I wasn't that woman anymore, and I didn't need to cling to her mistakes. Life had moved on, and so had I. As I stood, a family walked past, a mother, a father, and two young children, laughing and chasing each other. I watched them for a moment, their joy contagious. It struck me then how life had a way of moving forward, no matter how much we tried to hold on to the past. And maybe that was the point. The world didn't wait for us to figure things out. It simply carried on, giving us the chance to catch up when we were ready. I turned away from the bench and began walking back toward the trailhead, the crisp leaves crunching beneath my feet. I didn't know what the future held for me, but for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty felt like an opportunity rather than a burden. I was no longer defined by my mistakes or my losses. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon with hues of orange and pink, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to move on. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because the best chapters of my story were still waiting to be written.